Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be in this world. This is Danny Dhaiphong. Good to be on another stream, the last before a prolonged holiday. But I wanted to introduce my guests because we have returning friend of the show, Brian Berletic from the New Atlas, and his first time on the show. I've been following his work at iEarlGrey for quite some time. Mike Jones, how are both of you doing? Good to have you on, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and always a pleasure to be seated next to Brian. So yeah, thank you both very much for having me.
Yeah.
So likewise.
Great. Yes. So of course, everyone, you know what to do. Make sure you're liking the stream as you're coming on, subscribing to the channel, and supporting the show in all the ways that you can, if you're able, in the links in the description. But let's not waste any time because I know time is very valuable for both of you. So I want to just turn to you, Mike, and just ask you, one, there was some scare that you went missing. I know that I've heard you on George Galloway's show and some other places talking about it and how you are fine, and that's great. You are here. But you have actually been traveling to the front lines of the Donbass region for quite some time, doing a lot of work there, sending aid to the people. Could you talk about your work, what got you into that, and how does it relate to this conflict? Because you've been covering this conflict for quite some time and are really one of the leading, I think, voices from the West. Now, I believe you live in Russia, correct? And, doing a lot of work to expose the truth of the situation. So I just want to turn to you first and allow you to talk about your work.
Sure. So for those people watching that aren't quite familiar with some of the backstory to how I got into this. So yeah, I currently live in Moscow in Russia. I've lived in Russia since 2018. I actually held off for a little while about covering the special military operation. I had a YouTube channel that was previously gaming based, so I didn't want to do gaming, despite that being the industry I was in. I thought it felt quite dirty, talking about this alternate universe with something going on that was such seismic, actually, certainly in the geopolitical field. For about a month or so, I was on WhatsApp, with friends back in the West, and kind of chuckling at the very conflicting news that was going on. So they'd send me an article, and I'd say, "Oh, that's interesting. That what you're seeing, here's what I'm seeing." And we'd kind of chuckle about the discrepancies between the two. But then it got to the point where I lost track of the lies. And I'm not going to say who was lying. I'm just saying I just lost track of the changing narrative between the two sides. So I thought, actually, I'm going to have to document this. So I carried on in the same format that I was doing with the sort of gaming updates and things, and I did it with the news. And I think of 10,000 subscribers roughly that I had on that old channel at the time, I think I lost 100 and then gained 100,000 within about 6 months. There was clearly a hunger and a need and a market for this. Very quickly, RT, was banned in some of these, not all the Western countries, but many of them. And eventually that's what got me pretty much banned now, because NewsGuard picked up on the fact that I was restreaming Putin's speeches, Lavrov, Zakharova, live with translation, but most specifically because I reposted RT documentaries. I'm very open about that. It was very clear I didn't have the means to produce these documentaries, but there was clearly an appetite for this information and for people to try and decide for themselves. NewsGuard, being a front company for the US State Department, I have no doubt whatsoever, has successfully lobbied YouTube and now has seen me with a second consecutive ban, third overall, where I'm unable to post, which exacerbated the situation you just touched on when I lost contact with my colleague John Mark Dugan back in Moscow. And that only came about. I visited the front lines near Solidar, which is quite close to Bakhmut. And John lost touch with me, and our plans changed due to being out of communication because of the Ukrainian practice of targeting foreign SIM cards. So, of course, I had to turn my phone pretty much completely off and leave it that way for fear of exposing any position or inviting any artillery on our position where we were. So that coincided with having said that I'd be back at the hotel that evening and then not, and having to hunker down in a basement near Solidar, Bakhmut, Artyomovsk as it's now known, therefore resulted. Unfortunately, John went public. I've already reamed him out about it, and Masha has as well. He went very public very quickly. You usually give it at least 24 hours and you send out the search parties first. But I was in good hands. Of course, I was in some level of danger. I can't say I was never in any danger. Being that close, of course, you're at some risk. But I was in good hands with good people, and they took good care of me. So everything was okay, thank goodness.
Great. I just had a microphone snafu.
I
hope I'm back. Oh yeah, well, I'm glad you are safe. Give me a quick sound check, everybody. But
you're all good.
Good. Okay, so with that said, yes, great that you're okay. Interesting that Ukraine is targeting foreign SIM cards to then shell. Could you comment on that? I mean, maybe both of you can comment on that. Yeah.
I've pretty much said the advice that I was given by the frontline soldiers at the time, that they're scanning using these technologies to identify, and I have a Russian SIM card, so I would be a prime target. Masha had a local one that wouldn't be quite as at risk, but still, you can't take any chances, especially when and this is, Brian will understand from his military background as well, it's not about yourself, it's about those around you, so you don't want to put anyone else at risk. But Brian, feel free to weigh in.
Oh no, that it makes perfect sense. I think both sides are looking for this type of signal to home in on under certain circumstances. I think we're all well aware that Ukraine is much more liberal on where it targets, and they have a habit of deliberately targeting civilian areas. And if they, I could easily see them rationalizing, well, it's probably civilians, but they've got a Russian SIM card, so let's just send off a few rounds, see what we can get.
Sure. Some people have also commented about foreign SIM cards. Well, yes, due to the infrastructure, yes, these regions are recognized by Russia as Russian territory. But I think the only Russian telephone provider is MTS that has got itself set up in these regions. So when you're on a network that is Russian owned, that is not currently operating in these regions, then yes, it's easy to say foreign SIM card, whereas yes, I'm appreciated as Russian territory according to Russian law. So I just clarify that point to the eagle-eyed in the comments.
Right. Well, maybe we can now pivot to this attack on Moscow. You are there, Mike, in Russia, and I'm wondering what the reactions are to this, and maybe we can talk about where this fits in. Vladimir Putin's calling it a war crime. It was this drones were targeting a residential building. And while I don't think there are any dead, and I think Russia's air defenses actually were quite effective, this seems like it's happening more and more. There was an earlier attack on the Russian government, on the Kremlin, in early May, And of course, there have been terrorist attacks inside of Russian territory, numerous, targeting journalists and others who perhaps are saying the wrong thing about the Ukraine conflict. So maybe we can turn to you, Brian, first about what's your reaction to this and where you see this fitting in this larger setting of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to hear from Mike about how on the ground, how the Russian population is reacting to this. But this fits into the pattern that Ukraine has exhibited for many months now. They're unable to make anything happen on the battlefield strategically, so they focus on these highly visible political acts that are, as has been said by Russian commanders, these are irrelevant strategically, tactically, psychologically. I would almost bet that Russian people see this and react in a way that is more supportive of Moscow than the other way around. It's only going to make things harder for Ukraine. It will give Moscow more political capital. I think, the attack on the Kremlin, I think when the Russian people see Ukraine shelling the Donbass region, using HIMARS on Donetsk city, I think it just compounds their problem. I don't think it's doing anything to help them. And again, this is because they cannot make anything happen on the battlefield strategically.
Just to back up what Brian said, news today about shelling in the Belgrade region of Shebekino, in that area of Russia. The West is crowing about the fact that, there's an incursion in Russian borders and there's an evacuation. Well, yes, Russia is taking the commensurate measures to protect its population by evacuating them out of there, because Ukraine is shelling civilian structures, as it has done for the past 9 years in Donbass. It's now doing it directly to Russian Federation territory, as recognized by international law, I will stipulate. This is typical behavior of Ukraine for the reasons that Brian's just said, because they can't make any effectual or effective actions on the battlefield. Today, even the Ukrainian commander has admitted that around Bakhmut/Artyomovsk, that any advance there has slowed to a halt. There's no further progress that they can make. James cleverly claiming that, Ukraine is completely justified to extend its power beyond its borders and hit Russia. And he said in self-defense against military targets. Well, but we've not seen that against military targets. Cleverly, not so cleverly as I prefer to call him. I mean, he talks a load. And then we've got Jean-Karim Pierre, who says the opposite. We don't support any strikes outside of Ukraine's territory, which, she's got the hairstyle of a clown, and you can paint her up pretty easy to look like a clown. But yeah, sounded very clownish when she said that, given that it is definitely Western, if not US-based equipment that is facilitating this. The reaction, as Brian's just said correctly, is a solidification, further cohesion of Russian public sentiment, and all it does is just serve to prove Putin right. Both, not just now, I'm talking about over the years since the Munich conference, where he gave that speech there that not led up to this, but was prior to all this, where he said about NATO's actions, certainly in the West, and Medvedev. A lot of other people have picked up on what I did as well, where his latest tweet, or the tweet regarding this, a comment by James Cleverly, where he said, England, our eternal enemy. I mean, that's a huge shift there. I'm not just saying from Medvedev. Medvedev has gone from being quite sympathetic to the West, as everyone acknowledges and knows, to now very hawkish and quite bellicose, actually, in his language recently. But to state that as well as our eternal enemy, I wouldn't say that Russians are that far. And he has been picked up. I've read it in Russian media. He has been picked up on that phrase. It then said that London is quite concerned by that rhetoric. So I guess good job, Medvedev, on that regard. It hasn't worked to date to make London worried about anything. Look at this attack on the Black Fleet. Those, I believe, were British drones. These boats that were sent against the Black Sea Fleet. And great hullabaloo said, we've attacked the Russian fleet. And then it rocks up, I believe, in St. Petersburg not long later, fully fine, no problems to it, despite all the claim in the West. And yet the Russians also had footage of destroying these drones with, they called it conventional artillery armaments of these naval forces. So I really don't know where Ukraine got that idea from. Add all that, if we want to touch on the Western propaganda, I've literally got an article up in the Daily Mail where it's talking about how a Russian missile nearly hit a motorist. And what they don't do is show the freeze frame of the missile, because the freeze frame of the missile shows it's a Patriot missile that comes down on the highway. But hey, it's Russian, whatever. And even in the comments, some of the first comments there are like, yeah, guys, even Kiev admitted that was a misfired Patriot missile. Just like kind of ease it down a little bit. But yeah, overall, these attacks on Moscow, ineffectual. US media, I shared on Telegram today, showed a collapsed building that they said was a result of the drone attacks on Moscow. Turns out that building was in Iowa, and it happened a few days ago.
Wow. I mean, when you have Daily Mail readers, just debunking the Daily Mail, things are bad. Yeah, because I know you're aware of the Daily Mail's reputation, and
if it's in the Daily Mail, it must be true. Was the sardonic kind of catchphrase that we had for the Daily Mail back in England. Yeah.
I mean, the propaganda is absolutely just, it's so stark and it's so in our face. But then there's this, like, what does this get Ukraine? And most of us understand, who watch this program and who will follow your work, Ukraine doesn't do anything without the United States' salute. So what, if it's not effective, what is this doing for Ukraine to do these ineffectual strikes on Russia, like now deep into Russian territory, not just the territories that have recently been integrated?
Is that directed at me?
Oh, Brian, or you can go first.
I'll let Brian go.
Okay. Well, I think it's for a lack of any better options. What else can Ukraine do at this point? And as Pike was pointing out, the propaganda is becoming ridiculous. And when you lie about everything all the time, even your own lies start to contradict each other. So I saw some tally of, Iskanders. They claim however many Iskanders Russia has left. And they said, like, they fired 5, but the other day they claimed that they shot down 6 in one day. I mean, it's just because it's so ridiculous, so many lies, they can't even keep track of all of them. And anyone paying even slight attention to what's going on can see this. And I think even people who are supportive of Ukraine have to, in the back of their mind, realize that they're obviously lying. They cannot keep their story straight. What does that mean for the overall effort for Ukraine? How is this going to turn out? Why are they lying? If everything is going as well as they said that it was, why do they tell such ridiculous and such numerous lies? And I think the obvious answer is things are not going that well for Ukraine. I think we can see that.
I'll add, actually, I shared an article with another YouTube channel, a very big one, in fact, whereby, I want to get my facts straight, like with who actually reported it, because this was one of those common things that actually Brian has pointed out in some of his videos. It wasn't just the fact that American US 84 weapon systems, which were originally shipped to Ukraine, have been purchased by Cartel Golfo in Mexico. It wasn't just that. There was a Russian bombardment of Ukraine's capital kills at least 3 people. In that same article in NBC News, it, and I quote, says, Ukrainian air defenses shot down all 10 cruise and ballistic missiles launched by the Kremlin's forces, but falling debris caused damage and casualties on the ground, wounding 16 people, according to the authorities. So, sorry, but how does the headline match up to that? So, Russia killed at least 3 people, but Ukraine shot them all down and it only wounded 16. Now, unless 3 of the 16 went on to sadly pass away from their wounds, I don't know. But, like, even the same article, you have the headline, and then you actually read the content, and suddenly it doesn't quite add up there. And so you have one side who's relying on these tactics. As I've said, there's one case I've got links for where it's been called out with this channel using actually footage from another side of the world, alleged to be Moscow. And then you actually have the very, far slower than many people would expect, even Russians, progress, the very steady progress of the Russian forces. Particularly now we've just seen the fall of Bakhmut, which is, again, has been a slow, methodical process. It's not, people often criticize Russia, or they're losing the information war. Does that really matter when you've got the results on the ground? I then saw a CNN report about, forcibly shipping Ukrainians to Russia. Turns out it's not true. And then when CNN actually interviewed the refugees who'd come to Russia, they said, don't talk to me about Ukraine. We're seen as collaborators and we're already criminals because we've had to pass through Russia to get there, and actually we're going to stay. So one side that's relying on this, and then, again, as I've reported, Ursula von der Leyen, for the first time, actually, I could agree with her when she said she didn't support a ceasefire. So if we think that if Russia were to now slowly and methodically reach all the borders of these integrated territories following the referenda, what would happen then? And actually, I do agree with von der Leyen that no, NATO wouldn't tolerate a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities along these borders, because I believe NATO would antagonize. NATO would carry on destabilizing that area, or at least keeping this conflict going however which way they can. Not necessarily even if Ukraine is defeated, but if Russia achieves just the objectives, and I'm just limiting it, I'm not talking even about Odessa at this point, which many people believe is one of the objectives. But at this point, let's just stick to those areas that have voted to be part of the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation believes is part of it. Then no, that's the one time I've been able to agree with the head of the EU there. Brian, feel free to comment.
Well, you were talking about the AT-4 anti-tank rocket. That's
great
actually
accounting, Pentagon.
There's the most recent aid package. What is it dated? May 31st, 2023. They have more AT-4s because I guess they saw them in Mexico and they're like, well, I guess we'll just have to send them more so Ukrainians can use them. I mean, and it's, people predicted that this would happen. They said it's just a matter of time before we see these weapons somewhere else where they don't belong, because there's no accountability. Ukraine was notoriously corrupt even before this started. The people in charge are out of control, and there were all of these issues that even the West had to admit were taking place, and now we're seeing it. So there's AT-4 rockets, anti-tank rockets, in the hands of drug gangs in Mexico. And then you'll see the Americans and the U.S. government saying, oh, we need to do something about Mexico. This has been the U.S. destabilizing Mexico all along. This is just the most recent example illustrating this.
Again, apologies for laughing, but yeah, that's my dark humor.
I mean, it's so absurd. You either laugh or cry.
Yeah, well, speaking of absurd, and I guess also speaking of some of just all of these mixed messages that we're hearing, I want to talk about this counter offensive for a little, because on the one hand, you have the United States now talking about possibly freezing the conflict, and then you have, on the other hand, even people like Josep Borrell, Jungle Joseph, as I like to call him, and
like
folks
that
with Duran calls it.
Alex, yeah.
Yeah, Alex over the Duran. Definitely credit him for that one. But he is saying that, oh, well, Ukraine, the only thing we can do now is to push for full Ukrainian victory, meaning taking back all territories, even, Crimea, of course, is probably the hottest debated territory out of that conclusion. But I guess the point is it seems like there's some differences here. And you said Ursula von der Leyen opposes a ceasefire, unsurprising there. But at the same time, this Ukrainian counteroffensive seems to be one of these like dateless, always talked about topics in the Western mainstream media, especially. I'm wondering where is this at right now, and why are European and U.S. and officials in the collective West, why are they saying, like, it seems like they're saying 2, 3, 4 different things sometimes about the prospects of this counteroffensive, whether it'll happen, and what should be the path forward in this conflict? Why do you think this is occurring? Whoever wants to
let me just
begin.
interject first and just give you some great news that the spring counteroffensive is officially over. Fantastic stuff. So now it's the summer counteroffensive. So the spring, we enjoyed the spring counteroffensive, whatever that was. Andrei Murorochko, who I interviewed in Lugansk, I believe he was right. Now, obviously, time has proven him correct, that for certainly the spring offensive, that was a purely propaganda one. That was just an information war one. Prigozhin himself did warn about this. He did say that there was an imminent counteroffensive. So you can't really lay sort of all the, not blame, but all the speculation and all the hype on Ukraine, because Yevgeny Prigozhin played his role. And say what you will about his character and his antics recently. But yeah, I have to acknowledge that. Brian.
Well, we remember the same thing happening last year. The fall offensive was supposed to start in spring, and then it was constantly delayed. They had the Kharkov offensive, and then they had the Kherson offensive, and people weren't even sure if the Kherson offensive would even happen. But then eventually it did, and I think this one will eventually happen. When? Who knows? They're obviously delaying for time. Just like last time, they didn't feel like they were prepared. They really weren't prepared when they finally launched it. And I don't think that they will be fully prepared when they launch it this time, no matter how long they wait. We see these strikes by Russian forces on these arms depots, these massive explosions. We already can see that Ukraine cannot afford to lose any ammunition. They don't have any ammunition to spare. The West has no ammunition to spare in terms of replacing all of these quantities being destroyed in these strikes. That obviously is going to impact Ukraine's offensive potential. To what extent, I don't know. I think there will be an offensive. I think you cannot concentrate thousands of troops in a handful of areas along the line of contact and not make some progress. But if you look at Russian defenses, they've built it in layers specifically to give ground. The point is not to hold ground. The point is to destroy the Ukrainian military and to stop the offensive, not in terms of territory, but in terms of the troops that exist carrying out the offensive. This is what they did last time. This is what they will do this time. And I think we could all see, and even the Western media admits that this is pretty much the last chance, because there's nothing left to give Ukraine, nothing in practical terms that they can transfer to the Ukrainians that they can use to carry out any sort of large-scale offensive. So can they perpetuate this conflict for years? I think so. Yes, they can. But in terms of these huge offensives, no. We're looking at one of the last or the last. I think it is the last major offensive.
Yeah, I have to agree with Brian. If I can report things that I've seen on the ground, when I was driving to Donetsk, actually, I mentioned it to Master. I said, well, what are they doing over there? As we drove over one of the roads, I looked both to my left and my right, and there was extensive trench digging going on. Huge amounts of wood being piled up, which they were using World War I style to buttress the earth and keep it out. And I said, well, why? Of course, she didn't know at the time, but I said, can you ask the soldiers why they're preparing such extensive defenses if, everything's fine? And actually, I probably shouldn't say this from a propaganda point of view, but it was the fact that the DPR guys said that they don't trust anything. They fought this for 9 years now. So they are just taking the measures quietly to make extensive defensive fortifications anywhere they deem necessary. And clearly they've got the resources to do it. Whether that's coming from the Russian Federation, I can only speculate, or whether they've managed to appropriate these materials themselves. But there is huge fortification going on, particularly around Donetsk, which is right on the front line, certainly within HIMARS range. Again, I reported that as well. Another point that Brian made there about production capacity. This was an interesting conversation I had today on Zvezda, which was a Russian TV channel. And this actually relates to the very negative effect that even the performance of Storm Shadow missiles is having. So I went to Lugansk and I viewed the material evidence, which I think it's fair to say amounts to proof that Storm Shadow missiles were used against civilian population in Lugansk, which traditionally up until this point has been a resting stop for troops on rotation, has been considered a safe area. up until now, the employment of Storm Shadow missiles. So I haven't been able to publish it on YouTube yet, but I certainly shared it on Telegram, where the guys took me through all the evidence that they have that prove this was Storm Shadow missiles. Their point was, now people like India are looking at the French analog. Remember, this is British and French derived technology. And they're actually now reconsidering their purchases or contracts of these missiles because they don't believe that they can keep up with production. Add into that China, who is watching and learning very rapidly, also has a very competent, effective, integrated air defense system, is learning from Russia. And India, unfortunately, is, they're against Pakistan and China. So now the attraction previously to this weapon, and India's agreed to purchase both Western and Russian weapons. Quite how that works logistically, Brian's better to comment on it. But this was an effect that's affected stock prices of some of these weapon manufacturers as well. It's quite fascinating. It was something I'd not really thought about or picked up on before as a consequence of this conflict. And make no doubt that Russia's learning as well. Russia's testing, Russia's developing. Russia's kind of got the edge with these hypersonic missiles, as, again, Brian's discussed at length and better qualified to comment on than me. But there's some interesting factors and implications. I agree with Brian, by the way, about this offensive. This is the last throw of the towel. What's Ukraine got to gain by it? PR, more funding, if the US debt ceiling can allow it.
Yes.
So, Brian, please.
Well, yeah, about the Storm Shadow, HIMARS, the M777. Again, all the Western militaries over the last 2 decades plus, they have been focused on these small wars everywhere, fighting nations that have antiquated or non-existent integrated air defense systems. Iraq, for example, their air defense system was in shambles when the U.S. Invaded, and it still managed to take down some U.S. jets. Nothing that would change the tide, but still, they did that for the West has focused on building that type of military for decades, and I think people are starting to understand how long-term this is a process of transforming your military to perform an entirely different role. How long it takes to develop weapon systems, integrate them into your way of fighting. We can see how it's not as easy as just sending Storm Shadows or HIMARS or M777s to Ukraine and it just turning the tide on the battlefield. It simply doesn't work that way. I think it's definitely going to affect the bottom line of these weapon manufacturers. It's also going to convince nations around the world about the way to actually wage modern warfare. The Western model doesn't make any sense anymore. Unless you're going to fight a nation that basically has no military at all, and then in that case, what difference does it make what weapons you have, as long as you have a modern military? Doing things the Western way don't work if you're going up against an integrated air defense system using Russian or Chinese technology. It's very, very similar. There's some overlaps there. It doesn't make any sense. So I think a lot of nations are going to consider this. And I think what the West will do is increase the amount of coercion and bribery that it uses to push its weapons onto other countries, which, to be honest, a lot of countries have these weapons, not because they think they're the best, but because Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, they have a budget specifically for bribing and also coercing these nations.
If I can invite your opinion, actually, Brian, sorry, Danny, to jump in there, but there's 2 points I'll make. Storm Shadow, I believe, started to be developed in 1994. Again, you've just touched on the fact it takes this length of time. We're talking about F-16 fighters, which have gone off their 4th generation fighters. We're on 5th, I believe. When it comes to the use of these Storm Shadow missiles, one thing that the curator of these objects in Lugansk said to me, and he stressed this was speculation, but given the limited number of compatible Soviet aircraft, his speculation that he had read from other experts were that NATO was using something like the Rafael or Typhoon to fly into Ukrainian airspace, deploy the Storm Shadow, and then fly out. I don't know if you have any idea or comment on that.
Well, one of the biggest limitations for the Storm Shadow or any other missile like it that the West wants to send to Ukraine is that, yes, it is air-launched. Ukraine has hardly any air force left. They're constantly losing aircraft. They depend on Eastern European nations in NATO transferring what's left of their Soviet-era warplanes. If they are doing that, if they are using Western warplanes to launch these missiles, that's incredibly risky because as we've seen, and as is even admitted by the Western media, Russia is capable of downing aircraft flying over Ukraine, even from within Russian Federation territory with long-range air-to-air missiles. So imagine if they shot down one of these French-built warplanes, what implications that would have. That would be incredibly risky. So I don't know. I think that the Storm Shadow has been, and the plan to use it and transfer it over to Ukraine, I think this has been in the works for a long time. I think that's the reason they're sending the F-16, because I can't imagine what else the F-16 would be useful for. Nothing, virtually nothing. So I think that's what's going on here. And I think that is why there's this urgency to send them F-16s specifically for these air-launched missiles. It would be so risky to do it.
I agree with you, the F-16 and the urgency attached to it. The thing that counters that speculation is the claim by the Russian Ministry of Defense that they shot down the aircraft that launched those Storm Shadow missiles. If those had indeed been NATO aircraft, Typhoons, Rafales, or anything like that, I think there'd be far more media attention to that. Certainly from the Russian side in particular, if they could confirm that and had actual facts to back it up. So I just thought that was an interesting piece of speculation. And now that you've said, about the F-16, I wouldn't expect it to be dogfighting with the Russian Air Force. I wouldn't expect it to be engaging in any form of combat like that. I agree with you. I would expect it to be kept at the maximum range possible, fly in, deploy the missiles, and get back to safety ASAP to preserve those aircraft. Because as others have discussed, Colonel McGregor, among many others, the people flying these things are not going to be Ukrainian. They're most likely going to be sheep-dipped volunteers.
Yeah, agree with that.
Well, that would make sense too, because it's a matter of like, when will these get into like use in the conflict? It doesn't seem like they're going to be part of this counteroffensive. Maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps the counteroffensive will happen some fall, winter, who knows? But how effective then will these F-16s be if Russia has the capability of shooting them down? And it seems like, I mean, I just take the case of the Netherlands. They don't even want to give up their planes yet. All they want to do is train pilots. So where are these planes actually going? These F-16 fighter jets, where are they going to come from, and when? I don't. I'm confused. I'm always confused by this conversation that happens about weapons pledges and then actual distribution and use.
I'll let Brian feel this one first.
Okay, so there are several European countries that are getting rid of their F-16s. So basically, they're going to unload them on Ukraine. They're going to be getting the F-35, which I believe is an equally useless, overpriced piece of hardware. And I've kind of thought about this for a while. You're going to see F-16s shot down. It's going to look bad for Lockheed. But what it's going to do is allow the U.S. to put pressure on so-called U.S. allies that currently have F-16s and are trying to upgrade their fleets. They will say, look at them getting shot down over Ukraine. It's an old plane, just buy F-35s. And they will make much more money that way with the F-35. They're not going to be sending the F-35 to Ukraine to be shot down, in front of the world. So it might actually work out well for Lockheed. It's not going to help the Ukrainians out at all. They had an air force in February 2022. It was destroyed. It was decimated, and everything that NATO has fed into it since then has been destroyed and decimated. So why do people think that F-16s either piloted by NATO volunteers or by Ukrainians trained to operate it? Why do they think that this is going to turn out any differently? I don't think that it's going to.
No, I have to absolutely agree with you. And that lends into, as I said, this discussion I had today. And we're not just talking about Storm Shadow missiles. We're talking about a range of missiles, the Patriot, the dated Patriot as well. I mean, trying to claim they shot down a hypersonic missile and then showing a completely different munition from the mayor of Kiev was, well, it would be amusing if it wasn't tragic. But we're kind of seeing consistently. And then the as you've just said, like you have F-16 shot down. Leopards have been destroyed. It's been reported in Russian media. I can't comment further on that. For some reason, the Russians aren't showing the evidence of that yet. But watch this bit and forget that I said that. So we're already having that with other Western weapons that are being sent there, and it's not a good look. For all this supply, the Gepard tanks, so I say tanks, the platforms, the anti-aircraft platforms, are being destroyed. We're seeing like even the drone footage of them being knocked out. And we had this whole hullabaloo with Patriot missiles systems. Were they knocked out? Were they not? Well, yeah, they were knocked out. And they're proving pretty much ineffective, which is not, again, you have to say, which is not a bad reflection on the operators if they are indeed Ukrainian. It's just simply the situation they're in, and also the technology that they're using against the technology they're up against. It's not a good look, and yes, it is reflecting, seemingly, in the share prices of these Western arms manufacturers, which in turn then, on the grander international scale, when Newland comes along to India and say, hey, you got to buy our systems, like you've just said about the F-35, it's not really a good sell, really, when they're performing so badly in this. And again, I hate to be so cold-blooded, but what is a test environment now, as Ukraine's being used, by both sides? Let's, again, not point the finger at anyone in particular. Both sides are testing these technologies. We're seeing with electronic warfare with drones now, which has been quite chilling, actually, from certainly Patrick Lancaster's, one of his latest reports about the drone combat that's going on, which something as a former infantryman, I never factored into my consciousness in training. It was, was scanning the bushes and trying to identify where shots came from. You never thought to look up above that someone would drop a munition right on your shoulder and blow your head off. Sorry to be so graphic, but that's sort of the nightmare that we're seeing. And again, I'll say it, unfortunately, Ukrainians are suffering. Human beings are suffering. It's a nightmarish environment.
Yeah, and perhaps now we can talk about NATO's other wars, because there has been some activity in Serbia, in Serbia's Kosovo region. There's been protest demonstrations after a municipal election where Serbian people are claiming it's completely bunk, 4% turnout. And of course, Serbia's political class, their officials have been saying for quite some time that Kosovo's leadership has been wanting the Zelensky treatment. And so could you comment on what's happening there? There is a long history with NATO and Serbia, of course, dating back to the former Yugoslavia. And while I don't think anyone died in what was a pretty intense clash between NATO occupation troops, Kosovo forces, and Serbian people. And so I'm wondering, what's your impression of this, your reactions? Whoever wants to begin. Maybe Brian, if you want to begin.
Yeah, Brian.
And the Duran actually did a really good job covering the situation in Serbia and explaining the whole background. The point that I want to make is that Kosovo, under international law, is recognized as part of Serbia, and yet the U.S., the rest of NATO, are playing this game where they're encouraging separatism, all while at the same time wringing their hands about Russia violating Ukraine's sovereignty, and then also we can talk about Taiwan, a province of China recognized as such by the UN, by the U.S. State Department officially on its website right now, and yet at the same time treating it like it's a separate country. This completely undermines the West's entire argument about upholding the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, which, by the way, since 2014 hasn't had any sovereignty. The elected government was thrown out of power by a U.S.-sponsored coup. So it's just another example of how the West is undoing its own legitimacy. And I think that's because the window of opportunity for it to assert itself as a global hegemon, that window has closed. They're still trying to encircle and contain both Russia and China at the same time. And when you're rushing, you're out of options. These are the kind of things that happen. All of these contradictions that make no sense and only end up undermining your your credibility, which I think at this point the West has none.
Indeed, Putin's used the Kosovo example in his speeches and arguments. How the West will recognize Kosovo, but they won't recognize the autonomous regions in the Donbass, as well. As the double standards just keep going on there. We've seen unsuccessful attempts, I believe personally, to open a second front in other countries. I think they even tried it in Georgia. They've tried it elsewhere. And now Kosovo is like this old scab that they're just picking at again, it appears, because of the leadership's reticence to toe the line. We've seen it both with Vucic and we've seen it with Orban as well. These leaders who have then been, well, yeah, I mean, it's oversimplified to say bullied, but it's far more complicated than that. And we're seeing almost that same bullying nature trying to be exerted on South Africa, among other nations as well. But specifically with these second fronts, yeah, I agree. I think, 14 Italians were injured in these conflicts with in Kosovo around Serbia and this. And I saw a report today about prayers for peace in Kosovo, and behind there you could hear gunfire and tear gas being deployed, and even it claimed artillery. I didn't hear artillery in that video, but this report said that. And once again, I feel sympathy for the people here being subjected to these geopolitical games being played by the West, and it only serves, as Brian says, to really show them for who they are and the game they're playing, which again, when the Russian media reports it, it just serves to strengthen the whole reason this special military operation, as they call it, is going on.
Yeah, and on Twitter, Kosovo's Serbia was trending, and it made me think that, well, NATO is not Serbia. Why? So Kosovo, yeah, attempted to break away. I think it was a little over a decade after the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which kind of cemented the split of that country into many different pieces. But why is NATO still there? Like, why is NATO in Kosovo? And, earlier this spring, actual spring, not Ukraine's version of what spring is, but, earlier this spring, you had Vucic talk about possibly color revolutionary activity inside of the country. And he linked it to opposing sanctions, not going along with Western sanctions on Russia. I don't know if, Brian, you wanted to comment first, and then...
Yeah, well, I just want to point out the Rand Corporation published that paper extending Russia. And this is one of the things they talked about, was creating all of these crises along Russia's periphery. Now that they're in this proxy war with Russia through Ukraine, it's exactly as Mike said. They're doing this to complicate matters for Russia as much as possible, and in an attempt to overextend Russia to get them to spread their resources thin. But I don't think that it's going to work. And at the end of the day, when they create these crises, if they want to actually reinforce what they're doing there, NATO has to invest. And what do they have left to invest? So it just seems like a very unsustainable strategy. But we've seen them do this, say, when the proxy war in Syria, the regime change operation in Syria. They did the exact same thing. They created crises all around Syria, inside of Syria, in Iraq, for example, the whole ISIS situation. And ultimately, it didn't change anything. It's it dragged the conflict out longer. But Syria, Russia, Iran, they understood what was going on and they paced themselves. And that's exactly what Russia is doing right now. It's pacing itself. People are wondering, where's the big arrow offensive? Why aren't they just sweeping across? Because they want to conserve their manpower and their equipment for various contingencies. And why, if you can do it slowly and time is in your favor, why speed it up and lose men and equipment unnecessarily? So I think this is, I don't know. I think you had another question, Danny. I'm not sure if I got it or not. There was another part to that question.
It's okay. Mike, have your comments, and we can circle back.
Yeah, Brian. Both Brian and I have covered that Rand report in previous videos that we've done of this trying to stretch Russia. Whereas I think, again, as Brian's just said, I think Russia's playing this long game because it serves its interests. And that's horrible to think about, actually, when you think about the blood cost involved. But the longer this pans out, the West is, first of all, destroying its own propaganda and narrative, as we've said, but also the economies. Now we've got the suspension of the debt ceiling, got all these things. It does seem to serve Russia's interests to pace itself, take its time. And that you can understand. But as I said, when you go to the front lines, you see, and you've seen some of the footage, as the people in the comments have seen as well, of the hell on earth that is resulting of it. I hope to go to Bakhmut in July to actually see for myself the devastation there, which even Zelensky himself compared to Hiroshima and all this. But they've played their part. And my main message is I hope it's all over very soon. But in the geopolitical sphere, and we've even talked in a cold-blooded way about testing grounds and so forth, I think these psychopaths, certainly even the analysts at RAND as well, are quite happy with it. Lockheed Martin, I'm sure, Raytheon are also very happy about it. And I don't see any... It's actually from China that we've seen a peace plan. We've actually seen it from Lukashenko in Belarus. There are too few people, in my opinion, talking about a peace plan and an off-ramp for this. And when we come to NATO, I have to agree with Medvedev again about this idea that it's a defensive organization. I mean, that is laughable at this point, at any juncture. And then the talk that NATO is divided, I don't know that for a fact, but that's a common recurring allegation that's coming on. I have to agree with it. It seems to be a shambles, and it seems to be, the West always seems to be reactive. If I, from what I observe, especially with Joseph Borrell and von der Leyen, they just seem to throw money at the problem and think it's going to go away, and thinking they can't address the root causes. I really don't even want to entertain the idea of what they think the end result of all this will be.
And I think that's what makes the Serbia situation so interesting. To your point, Mike, is that it's laughable to call NATO a defensive organization when it's literally occupying Serbia and causing unrest in that country, given its role in supporting separatism in Kosovo, and not to mention its just absolutely horrific role in destroying that region, destroying the country that Serbia was once a part of, Yugoslavia.
Let's not forget Biden's comments about how proud he was about advocating to bomb Belgrade. I mean, that's a pretty viral clip. I hope most people watching are aware of that and how happy he was about it. And I'm not even talking about Lindsey Graham, talking about killing Russians is the best money we ever spent. What an idiot.
Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. If people actually pay attention, if they ignore the polarism in American politics, and they actually look at foreign policy from one administration to the other, clear-headed of any sort of ideology, they will see that is all the U.S. and NATO have done. It's an organization that implements military aggression around the world. They were in Libya. What does Libya have to do with defending Europe? It makes no sense. Afghanistan is in Central Asia. What did that have to do with defending Europe or the United States? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And then as time goes by, we look back at the pretexts used to justify these wars of aggression, and we can see just how flimsy or non-existent the pretexts were. And it's not a defensive organization. It is to implement hegemony around the globe. It is to encircle and contain Russia, and now they're setting up a liaison office in Japan because they want to branch out into Asia. I mean, it really is an evil organization trying to take over the world. And talking about Lindsey Graham and his sidekick John McCain there, for a while there, they would go to these different countries. They would associate with the absolute worst people in those societies. I'm talking about Al Qaeda, people associated with ISIS in Ukraine, actual armed Nazis. That's who they're going into these countries to assist, give weapons to, and unleash on the people. The local people, the neighboring countries have to deal with the fallout for all of these conflicts, wars and proxy wars. So no, NATO is not a defensive organization, and this is what Russia was faced with. A lot of people are still trying to question whether or not Russia had an alternative to launch the special military operation. Just look at what they did in Georgia from 2003. They overthrew the government there. They pumped it with weapons. They trained the troops. And in 2008, they attacked Russian forces. According to an EU investigation into the conflict, that was their conclusion, that it was Georgia that provoked that conflict. Then they did the exact same process from 2014 onward in Ukraine, only on a much, much larger scale, making it a much more serious threat to Russian national security. Also, they had Crimea. I mean, if you're going to make an argument for Kosovo, how can you make a different argument for Crimea, especially when a year beforehand, a U.S. government-funded poll found that people identified as Russian, and even before the Maidan, I think it was almost a quarter of them wanted to join the Russian Federation. That was before they had all of these additional reasons to do so. So it's just so obvious of what a threat NATO is. It's so obvious that Russia was acting in self-defense. They had already been attacked once. It wasn't as if we're not sure where this is leading. They knew absolutely where this was leading. So I mean, if you're going to talk about a preemptive war, this is you can definitely make a case here, whereas say in Iraq, no, you cannot.
I'd like to add, I was sent a message today saying that Zelensky had urged all countries bordering Russia to join NATO. Now, seemingly Zelensky failed to consider China and North Korea in that, but I haven't found that quote from Zelensky, so let's just call that an anecdote at this point.
It would not be out of character, though, certainly. He says a lot of things, and oftentimes they're a little incoherent, to say the least. But here's what you were talking about, Mike, what Joe Biden said about Belgrade and his involvement. So let's just listen. It's just 20 seconds, and we can kind of maybe end this topic here.
Different. I just want to know what you suggest, because back then, when I was in your position, I was suggesting we bomb Belgrade. I was suggesting that we send American pilots in and blow up all the bridges on the Drina. I was suggesting we take out his oil supplies. I was suggesting very specific action. And isn't it interesting that we didn't?
So there you go. Joe Biden suggesting war crimes hard during the war on Yugoslavia. Reactions?
Cut from the same cloth as Lindsey Graham.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And imagine if Russian President Vladimir Putin was ranting and raving like that about wanting to blow up all the bridges, all the oil, everything in and across Ukraine. I mean, could you imagine what the reaction would be?
Waving his pen. I was suggesting we roll into Berlin and stay there and never give it up again. I was suggesting blitzing the rubbish out of Poland. Actually, on that note, though, I shared a clip on Telegram about Putin, in his own words. That's the Telegram channel, where Putin was questioned about this. Would you like to rule the entire world? You know, the West likes to say that Putin's going to conquer the whole world. That's his megalomaniac dream and ideal. Actually, he flippantly replied, "Of course," but then he followed it up more seriously and said, if you want to look to the people that do want to rule the world, the headquarters are not in Moscow, they're in Washington. And I think that is quite apparent, actually. Again, you can say, oh, that's just Russian propaganda. But all the evidence we've just discussed and the tactics that we've seen employed of late, and not just from Russia, and as I've touched on with South Africa complaining of EU and US State Department bullying, we've seen these panicked visits from US representatives to various countries, including India, as well, in reaction to certain events that play out. Blinken, some of his words as well. It's very clear and apparent. And with this idea of Taiwan, which I still can't wrap my head around the US thinking on that. I'm sure there's a RAND report that might be able to explain it.
Several.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I really don't understand what the West is. When I was on the front lines, embedded with this unit, Veterani, I chatted with them for a few hours, and for the first couple of hours, they were a bit standoffish of me due to my nationality, and they didn't know me from Adam. And I explained my story, and first of all, they said that it was a big morale boost, that what I was doing and the work I was doing on YouTube, and they were like, "Thank you for that. That really helps us." But then they said, "We think you're really brave for being here." And I couldn't accept that. I said, "No, it's not bravery." And they said, "Well, what is it? Why are you here on the front lines under artillery shelling in a basement with us? And you're Solidar on the front lines?" And I said, "It's anger, actually." So I really had to wait a few seconds and sort of look inside myself and think, yeah, why am I here? I said, it's anger. I'm angry at the betrayal of my country. I'm angry at the betrayal of the memory of my grandfather and what he fought for. And perhaps that's not the best motivation, but I wonder if that explains also many other people in the West as well who are angry at the leaders, their words, their actions. People like Lindsey Graham, they don't represent me. I'm sure they don't represent the majority of the US people. And these guys, the DPR guys that are on the front lines, they understand that as well. They say, we know we aren't fighting the American people. We know we're fighting the American government, among others, even when we have these American munitions land on us. But we know who our enemy is, and we know the ideology that we're fighting as well. And remember, these people are on their homeland. So I'd invite also Americans to consider, if your homeland was threatened, what would you do? These guys are doing exactly the same.
Absolutely. And speaking of anger, I mean, that is what has always driven me. Absolute outrage and anger about what is being done in my name by my government. And when you see it in person, the damage that is being done. I mean, I've seen the burned down sections of Bangkok, the US-backed mobs in 2010. I've seen the bombing in 2015 because Thailand sent these Uyghur terror suspects back to China after the US told them not to. I've seen that. It makes me angry, and that is what compels me. It's just absolute outrage at the injustice. And you talked about President Putin and referring to who's actually trying to rule the world. I mean, the 800 plus US bases around the globe, that is a little bit of a clue as to who wants to. And also the fact that if you look at US military command, the way they divide it, it's divided in sections of the planet rather than sections of the United States. Like Russia has its districts. China has its districts inside their territory. They don't have a command for like on the other side of the planet. The U.S. does. They have military areas around the entire planet. I mean, it's so obvious that this is the modern day empire of our times. And it's just amazing how they can convince people that it is. So many people are unaware that it is actually the empire of our time.
Yeah, the Indo-Pacific Command, these command structures you're talking about, Brian, it's huge. I mean, it dwarfs any other of the command structures that the U.S. has propagated. And I know you're in Thailand, so you know quite well the U.S.'s military footprint all across the Pacific. But anger, how could you not be angry? Because it doesn't benefit anyone. I mean, Mike, I know you're from the UK. I'm in the United States. It's like these countries are not getting any better. Things aren't getting better for people here, and yet you have massive investments. I mean, you can't even put into real thought, like how much money this is to then kill other people. I know, like, you've been in these war zones in the Donbass. I mean, these weapons that NATO is sending, the US in particular, especially, they're killing people. They're killing innocent people that are just trying to live their lives and are trying to make a better life in the United States and its NATO. I don't know if you can call them partners, vassals. They are doing the opposite for their own gain, and that is infuriating. And so I think, it's very human. I think you're not really in touch with your humanity if you do not get angry at such a phenomenon. But it's really easy to get caught up in the misinformation web. But speaking of which, I wanted to.
It's not benefiting the people of Ukraine.
No.
When
no.
you ask what it's
No.
all
As for
for,
the economy, Ukraine's
No.
economy is destroyed.
absolutely not. And if you want to talk, yeah, sure. I've been from the Russian side of things, but I've been in the military. I luckily wasn't in a contact situation. I wasn't in a war zone. I wasn't deployed to any areas like that. Thank God. But my training was sufficiently good enough to understand that this is not Call of Duty. It's not glorious. It's hell. And I commented on another podcast the other day that one of the things that hit me when I was in my training was I grew up with big alls, and I grew up with Second World War and all this, fight for king or queen of country, depends. Now it's just changed. But there was this bigger idea, for your country. Back even 2003, so, over 20 years ago in my case, back then it wasn't that, because we had the Iraq war going on. Later to be Afghanistan, where I'd lose a few of my good friends. It was fighting for the man standing next to you. I did my minimum service. I got out due to the birth of my first daughter, and many of those guys came back and said, Jones, you were right to do what you did and get out whilst you could. And that was way back then. That was way back in Tony Blair, the war criminal that he is, never had an arrest warrant issued for his crimes. But despite all of that, being young, dumb, and full of spunk as we were, we still signed up, and we were going to do our duty, as it was still called back then. But I thought that was quite a telling shift. And with all of this and all these talk of Western values and democracy and all that, the cynical old soldier in me is just that absolute rubbish. And the devastation it's caused to not just areas like Bakhmut and all this, the actual human lives that are suffering because of it, for me is unforgivable. Certainly, as Brian said, not in my name.
So, speaking of rubbish, or perhaps the opposite of rubbish at the same time occurring together, maybe we can close. You've been very generous with your time, Mike and Brian. So maybe we can close on this topic, at least with all of you. I need to close up some things, so everyone stick around after the conversation portion. But I wanted to talk about you both have mentioned a bit about BRICS, and I know, Brian, you've been covering multipolarity a lot and talking about it a lot, especially on this program. And Mike, you mentioned the South Africa situation. So there's been what's a weeks-long spat now between the United States and in South Africa. And now there are reports, Russian officials are saying not true, but there are reports that perhaps the BRICS summit, because South Africa is a party to the Rome Statute and the ICC, that there's a lot of pressure being placed on South Africa to arrest Vladimir Putin should he attend the BRICS summit coming up in August in South Africa. And this also comes as you have, and you both also mentioned this too, like this trying to bring in other countries. Now you even have this House committee on the Chinese Communist Party advocating for India to become part of NATO plus. So you have all these developments, and it's coming as this BRICS summit is rapidly approaching. And Russia, of course, has been a huge leader. I know, Mike, you've talked about this, in de-dollarization, in fostering multipolarity. Both of you have covered this. So what is your reaction to this latest kind of what seems to be diplomatic cooling, this bullying that the United States is doing? And this is even to mention that China is not talking to the Pentagon. They've cut off their communications. They're saying, no, you're not going to sanction our defense minister and do what you're doing in all of this Taiwan in the Asia Pacific and expect cordial conversation at this moment. What is your reaction to these developments? It feels like the world is becoming more and more multipolar, and the U.S. is trying to foster more and more conflict as that happens. Whoever wants to begin, maybe Brian.
Yeah, I think it's part of this panic and this rush as they see this window of opportunity, either closing or closing tighter. Ultimately, it comes down to China. China is the biggest obstacle to the U.S. in this idea of reasserting itself as global hegemon around the entire planet. And so you see everything leading to that. You see them waging this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, but it's as part of a much wider agenda of encircling and containing China. Because they understand the relationship between Russia and China, and if they don't get rid of Russia first, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to deal with China. And then we see the U.S. I mean, could you imagine India at this point doubling down with the West? It seems very obvious they're working on getting out from under all of that because it doesn't benefit them, and they're big enough and strong enough to put their foot down and say, no, we're not doing this. And what really are you going to do about it? You know, if you put the sanctions on Russia and they blow up in your face, there's one after the other sanctions on China or restrictions on China. They haven't gone the full route as they have with Russia, but all of it's going to blow up in their face. If they do it to India, it will also blow up in their face. And they're not pulling anyone in their direction. The harder they push, the further everyone is going away from them. So I think that's what we're seeing. I think it's this desperation. They don't have a good plan because the premise itself of this small handful of people running the entire planet, when the playing field is leveling out the way it is in terms of technology, economics, military power, it doesn't make any sense to begin with. So everything you build up on this flawed premise is going to make less sense and be less sustainable. So I mean, I think that's what we're looking at.
I've not got much more to add to that. I think Brian's wrapped it up pretty well there. Well done, Brian.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe Mike, if you wanted to just any final comments on Russia's role in this multipolar world, the de-dollarization. You are there. How has this come about? I mean, it's obviously some of it's been in response to sanctions, but it certainly predates that. No.
Yeah, certainly. So since 2014 and the actions in Crimea, Russia has obviously been preparing for this day, which has now been pretty clear to everyone with hindsight and retrospect, that despite the criticism Putin faced at that time of not also going into Donbass and protecting them, as the West alleged, hanging fire, putting in the necessary systems in place, I believe that Russia has, well, let's face it, emboldened these other nations of BRICS to follow suit. But it's not just Russia taking a stand. As Brian said, it's the West's actions as well. We've seen it in Saudi Arabia. We've seen it with other nations as well, who have just seen the West for what it is, their actions, and they're sick of it. Africa's a huge one as well. We can't overlook the abuse of the African continent by multiple powers, including Britain, to mention just one of many, has led to this shift. And BRICS Plus is a thing. NATO Plus, you can dream about that. I'm not sure, and I hope it doesn't come to fruition. But there has been talk of, like a Trans-Pacific or whatever NATO that they were talking about a while ago. I think that's a ludicrous delusion. But with BRICS and I saw a graph about the purchasing power as well of G7 versus BRICS. BRICS has now surpassed the G7. There are factual things that these people in government and these countries are looking at and saying, hey, it doesn't serve, as Brian's just said, it doesn't serve our interests, certainly in the case of India as well. Russia's just become the #1 oil supplier, I think, as I just read today of that. You're looking at which side your bread is buttered. And sorry, Newland, it doesn't matter how many cookies you're going to pass out. And certainly not the case of India. It's not going to fly. And when you have the competence and professionalism of such countries like China with their diplomats and statesmen, and Russia as well, and this sheer arrogance and childishness that you've seen from the West, you don't have much faith in them. So who are you going to back? So I foresee that's the way that things are going to go. And that's not by Putin's evil design. I think that is purely common sense of people, and they realize and they understand, and perhaps they've been waiting for this opportunity, certain perhaps in the case of Africa, where again we've seen the US interfere in Somalia due to what was alleged to be an agreement with a Russian naval base of trying to stir up trouble there as well. people are sick of it, and perhaps I hope we're moving into a different structure and different framework that hopefully, as promised, benefits more people than it harms, as has been the case under the Western hegemony to date.
Definitely. And here, oh, Brian, before you start, I just wanted to point out the Africa context. Very good that you brought it up, Mike, because there is a push on the African continent, as you see here, to build a Pan-African system, the Pan-African payment and settlement system, so that these African countries can move out under the thumb of the dollar. Africa, arguably the most damaged by
and this
dollar
sort of talk
hegemony.
got Gaddafi killed, I'll just add.
Yes, definitely. Brian, please jump in.
Yeah, to build on what Mike was saying, if you look at the trend that's taking place, and you look at the aspects of how the West does foreign policy and how Eurasia is doing foreign policy, and then you look at the economies. Russia has a real economy. China has a real economy. They deal in tangible things like infrastructure and manufacturing and commodities. The West does not. It's all an illusion. It's a house of cards. So they're in this downward trajectory, and they're only going to continue to go down because they don't have a real economy. They don't have the option of leveraging a real economy to compete with, say, Russia or China or these blocs that are starting to emerge. So it's for them, it's hopeless, and the people running things are ill-equipped psychologically to admit that this is a losing proposition and to pick a more rational course of action. They're incapable of it. So unfortunately, I think they're going to have to, their system is going to have to collapse, and something is going to have to replace it. And just as Mike said, I hope that it's a system that benefits everyone in the West and in the East.
Yeah, and I definitely predict. It's pretty obvious. I mean, you brought up earlier, Brian, China being the principal target. If China is the principal target, Russia is 1A. And it seems like as BRICS countries become closer, as they come more and more together, as they expand BRICS, I think it's going to be a war on BRICS. I mean, I do think that the United States and it's going to take different forms. Not all countries will receive the same treatment, but even you see all across sources like the Financial Times, there's a lot of talk about, well, is India with us or not? Are they or are they not? There's going to be, I think, consequences, and we're already seeing it even with South Africa, a country that has pretty good, solid relations with the United States, get into some pretty open conflict around this question of de-dollarization and relations with Russia, which has been a sticking point for the United States in an attempt to try to poke and attempt to isolate countries that are continuing relations with Russia, which just happens to be the vast majority in the world outside of the G7 NATO bloc. So with that said, though, you all have been very generous with your time. So I'm going to stick around, everyone, because I have some announcements. I will kick it to you, Mike, and then Brian for any final comments within our conversation. Really appreciate you both coming on.
Thank you very much again for having me. The closing sort of statements that I'll give are that sometimes it feels like, certainly in YouTube, you're preaching to the choir. Many of those people watching here sort out a different perspective, sort out the different information, and they're open to it. I think the challenge now is actually extending it, because there's the majority of the people that just switch on the television, get told what to think, and they're happy with that in their way of life. So I think the struggle right now is for those people who agree with myself, Brian, and probably you, Danny, as well, that not in my name with this, is to actually get this message out to other people who might not be aware of it. Now, maybe they can't sit through an hour and 20 minutes of me talking my waffle, and Brian's excellent educated perspective on things, but I do think that this sort of message and these other information, given that we've seen the information war as well, where they're blocking both what China has to say, what many BRICS nations have to say, and obviously what Russia has to say about things. I think that's the main struggle that we have at this point, and that's the biggest challenge that I see.
Yeah. And closing thoughts. Number one, Danny, thank you for having me on. It's, again, great to share the screen with Mike. And I agree with that. And we have to keep doing what we're doing, because as things for the West get worse and worse, I think there's going to be many, many more receptive people. It's important to have these platforms and to continue trying to build them up as much as possible for when that window of opportunity opens, when people are going to be hungry for an explanation as to why this is happening, why, someone looks up on the internet, like I tell people all the time, look at these 4K camera walks through Beijing or Shanghai. If Americans see that and they're like, you mean you can walk through a city like that and not have some persons try to stab you with a bottle? Why are we putting up with this? They're going to want to know, and they're going to start looking for information. And if we have our platforms out there and we continue working to expand them, people are going to have all of that information at their disposal. Sometimes it feels futile, or like Mike says, you just feel like you're preaching to the choir. But I think over time, we're creating a collective body of knowledge that's going to benefit a lot more people as more people look for answers.
Definitely. Totally agree with both of your sentiments. Well, both of you have good evenings. We'll have to do it again sometime. It was a real pleasure, and we'll definitely be in touch. Everyone stick around. Got some announcements, possibly another story coming up. But take care, Brian, Mike.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.
Lazy bye.
Let's see. All right. So that was a great conversation with Mike and Brian. Definitely we'll have to do that again sometime soon. And yeah, everyone who stick around, I have some announcements. I also will probably cover one more story before I head out of here with all of you. So a few things I wanted to touch upon. I'm going to plug in actually first. So I want to touch upon a few things. So one, I am going on extended holiday, so no streams from me for what will be, so starting tomorrow, will be likely 2.5, if not 3 weeks. So no live video. There will be clips coming up here of past streams and content that I've done. And so please do, though, with that said, please do support the show. So after this break, I'm during before, as I prepared for this vacation, I have also been upgrading equipment, and I have the biggest piece coming, which is replacing my computer system. So please do support the show. Help this channel remain sustainable and expand. It's been growing quite nicely. And so all of that takes more labor as well as more equipment and technical costs to ensure that this show keeps going. So please do support. Patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong has annual subscription options. So does Substack. So you can also subscribe on YouTube and hit that join button for $4.99 per month. And all of these options provide certain perks, suggesting guests and content. You can also get early access, early footage, as well to videos and other work that I do, articles, etc. And you also get the knowledge that you are helping me in a sustainable manner, in a manner that keeps this work going. You can also do one-time options, and all of these are available not only in the video description, but also in the link tree in the video description and the channel banner. You can find all these options, the one-time payment options, if that works better for you, as well as the monthly and annual options on Patreon, Substack, and YouTube. So I really do appreciate it. But Patreon is the best way you can support. I really do appreciate everyone who sent super chats. I will try to get to those at the end and give you all a shout out. I want to give a shout out to the moderators, to everyone in the chat, everyone who's giving super chats. And I want to give a shout out to anyone who watches this later, and anyone on Patreon, Substack, YouTube, Telegram, all of those who follow me and support my work monetarily or not. Really appreciate all of you. Which gets me to the story I want to cover. we talked about this a little bit. See, iEarlGrey in the chat says, thanks for giving me the opportunity on YouTube while it's banned. Amazing. Yes, I didn't even know until Mike mentioned that he was banned. I know it seems like it's like banning season on YouTube, so it's some, you're banned and then you're back and then you're banned and then you're back. Luckily I've never been banned, but certainly during the first couple months of the conflict, all my videos were demonetized. And then I don't know, I think I just stopped doing YouTube as much and then came back and started to mix up the content as I would have done anyway, covering China and other issues worldwide. But now, I don't know, I think I found a formula to avoid it, but some folks cannot because like Mike and others, they're doing frontline work. Their content, the algorithm will pick it up. The censorship algorithm will pick up what people like Mike are doing. So definitely great to be able to get people like Mike here on this channel, given that censorship. So make sure you are okay. Some people are saying I'm still having volume issues. Yeah, it might be because of my gain and where my mic is placed. I had some microphone issues, so apologies for that. Hopefully it wasn't too disruptive during the stream. Well, that said, everyone, I want to get to a story. Okay, let's get to a story. And of course, you can keep liking that stream. We have 1,100 likes, 1,500 viewers. Amazing. So this will be the single story, and let's talk about China. All right, let's talk about China. I was thinking about doing Serbia. We talked a little bit about that during the stream, so let me hold off on that story. I'm sure there'll be more to come with Serbia. Can save those stories, but I want to talk about China because the United States is angry at China, and it's angry at China for many reasons. But this mainly surrounds now the Ukraine conflict. The United States is not happy with China's position. It's not happy that it's trying to broker peace. It's not happy that China has succeeded in brokering peace between countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it's certainly not happy that Li Hui, the Chinese envoy, is traveling around respective parties in this conflict, in the Ukraine conflict, seeking a peaceful resolution. Not happy. Definitely the United States is not happy. So over the course of the last several months, of course, you've had many diplomatic issues between China and the United States. You had the balloon incident. You've also had the spy crane incident. And you've had over and over. Now you have the Micron chip controversy where China has banned Micron chip manufacturer, a U.S. manufacturer of advanced semiconductor chips, because of the national security risks that it poses. This is according to China. And the facts kind of back up China here because the United States has been spying on Chinese tech and aviation for many, many years, according to WikiLeaks. But now the United States is not happy with China because China isn't talking to the Pentagon. So at the Shangri-La dialogue, which was supposed to be held in Singapore, the United States hoped that Lloyd Austin, defense chief of the United States, would be able to meet with his counterpart from China. China said not so fast. There will be no talks. And why is this? Well, there is, of course, the fact that China's defense minister, has been sanctioned, has been sanctioned by the United States for supposedly agreeing to supply weapons to Russia in the conflict. I don't know if you all remember, but this was something that was nonstop spoken about just earlier this winter into the spring. It was constant that China was providing weapons to Russia. China was thinking about providing weapons to Russia, and that led to diplomatic sanctions on China's defense ministry. So this was a red flag to China. And after the balloon incident, the so-called spy balloon incident, China cut off all kinds of communication, but especially around defense. And also, according to the United States, has not allowed Antony Blinken to make a visit to Beijing. China says that there was never any visit planned, but it's obvious that the United States has been making calls and saying, hey, can Antony Blinken visit? Can we have this dialogue, this meeting? It would make a lot of sense because European countries, many European leaders, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, you've also had Olaf Scholz, they've all made a trip to China. Many European countries have in the last several months, but the United States has not gotten any invitation. And according to the United States now, they're not picking up calls. So China is not picking up the United States' call. But not only is China not picking up the United States' call, it is preparing for what it's calling and what Xi Jinping is calling dangerous storms. So not only are our relations on this front extremely cold right now, extremely frigid, but now China is saying, Xi Jinping is saying that its security chiefs need to prepare for dangerous storms. The president has warned that the country must prepare for worst-case scenarios as its security situation deteriorates. And so Xi Jinping is warning that China is facing increasingly difficult and complex national security challenges and must prepare for quote-unquote worst-case scenarios by increasing its capacity to deal with internal and external threats. This is what Xinhua news agency reported Xi Jinping saying this past Tuesday, that we must be prepared for worst case and extreme scenarios and be ready to withstand the major test of high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms. He added that efforts were needed to modernize the nation's security architecture and get prepared for actual combat in dealing with practical problems. So I am not surprised by the headwinds, the choppy waters. This is how Chinese officials talk, and this is how Xi Jinping has been talking since he has come into power in China, but especially over the last 5 or so years in relation to the United States. But this is important, preparing for actual combat. And of course, there are many reasons why China will be preparing for actual combat, not least because the United States has hundreds of bases militarily surrounding China in various countries, Japan and South Korea holding the biggest U.S. Troop presence and base presence in the region. But also the United States has been organizing these countries into de facto military alliances. South Korea is looking to dock nuclear submarines from the United States. Japan has increased its military budget 2, 3, 4-fold in order to satisfy the U.S.'s aim to contain China militarily. And of course, you have warships being sent into the Taiwan Strait seemingly every other day by the United States. And there is lots of war game simulations happening on the U.S. side. So this, while many might become alarmed by Xi Jinping saying China needs to get prepared for actual combat and deal with practical problems, that's pretty reasonable given that China is militarily encircled and is being just legitimately under attack in this way. So Xi Jinping made his comments to the National Security Commission amid increasing tension with the U.S. And just this week, Beijing declined Washington's request for a meeting between the two countries' defense chiefs when both men attend a security conference in Singapore in June, citing the need for U.S. officials to respect China's sovereignty and security concerns. China cut off defense and climate ties with Washington last August over alleged meddling by U.S. officials in Taiwan. So that was August 2022 when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. It was seen as incredibly provocative because Taiwan, of course, is seen as part of China, as a country, China as a country that has a province of Taiwan. The One China principle has been violated over and over and over again by the United States. And there are, of course, concerns that the United States is supporting separatism there. And with Nancy Pelosi going over to meet Tsai Ing-wen last August, and then, of course, last month, you had Kevin McCarthy do the same thing, the current House Majority Speaker. That is an acknowledgement that Tsai Ing-wen, the president in Taiwan, in this autonomous region of China, is being viewed as a true diplomatic representative of a state. state-to-state visit. It's very concerning. And so China has been offended by this behavior. And of course, the United States has rubbed China's nose with it. So China's foreign ministry spokesperson Mao Ning demanded on Wednesday that the U.S. stops flying spy planes over the South China Sea, calling the flights dangerous provocations. Her statement came just one day after the U.S. Pacific Command accused China of causing a near collision by buzzing a fighter jet in front of an American reconnaissance plane in international airspace above the South China Sea. The South China Sea now, mind you, of course, is being always talked about in the Western mainstream media as being contested territory. But the fact remains that China actually has a right over at least portions of the territory of the South China Sea. That's why it's called the South China Sea. And that is just basic rules in international norms. The United States now has none of that. And of course, the United States brings up freedom of navigation and all of this based on economic interests and activity. And surely the South China Sea is one of the most important economic routes that exists in the world, where much of the trade by sea and by ocean occurs. However, the United States still has no jurisdiction politically there, but yet always attempts and has attempted for many years now to use its military force to influence the political and economic development occurring in the region surrounding the South China Sea. So the Pentagon has labeled China the most consequential systemic challenge to U.S. national security, an assessment that Beijing derided as an excuse to expand Washington's nuclear arsenal and maintain its hegemony. So Xi Jinping urges security chiefs to build up strategic self-confidence, improve the coordination of their operations, and utilize more advanced technology. He called for enhanced real-time monitoring of security threats, a better warning system, and improved handling of computer data and artificial intelligence. The complexity and severity of national security problems faced by our country have increased dramatically, said Xi Jinping. And who do you think Xi Jinping is talking about? He's not talking about Russia. He's not talking about countries that have maintained steadfast cooperation with China. He's talking about the United States and all of its vassal states, including those in the Asia Pacific, namely South Korea, Japan, Australia. All of these countries have sold themselves to the United States' aim of containing China and are shooting themselves, not just in the foot, they're shooting themselves straight in the gut. Not least because all of these countries depend on the Chinese market so heavily for their economies. Australia itself, export and import markets. China is the number one trading partner in both. South Korea needs China's market for semiconductor technology consumption because that's where all the manufacturing happens in China. And Japan, of course, needs China for economic cooperation, as what once was a dynamic economy of Japan continues to spiral into the abyss. So all of these countries are selling themselves to the United States to some extent, but all of them do not want to decouple with China. So the complexity of these challenges is grave because it does threaten to destabilize the economic architecture that surrounds China. And while China has the ability to really cushion these blows because it is a sovereign country, it does have independent foreign and economic policy, it is not at the whims of U.S. dollar domination. No, China does not need to depend on U.S. finance and the U.S. for economic development. It surely has been able to lift itself up out of poverty and develop rapidly. And I was listening actually to Scott Ritter on Jeff Norman in his program, U.S. Tour of Duty, and there was someone who I think from Moscow who asked, why doesn't the United States ally with either Russia and China against the other? And she mentioned that China doesn't have sanctions like Russia does. And while I agree that certainly Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, China is increasingly coming under, especially in this area of high tech, increasing sanctions from the United States. And these sanctions do make a difference. They do not have the same impact given China's overall position and ability to soften the blow, but they do have an impact, and they definitely have an impact on the world economy. So it's not just the military frontier that Xi Jinping is talking about. There is an economic component. There's a propaganda component. This is hybrid warfare, and it is escalating, and China is preparing on the military front as it should. U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has tried to stymie Chinese development of advanced semiconductor chips, at least partly because of their importance in advancing AI technology. Those measures have included restrictions on exports of semiconductors and advanced chip-making equipment to China. And then they talk about the Micron technology ban, the largest U.S. maker of computer memory chips, citing significant security risks. Some observers interpreted the move as a retaliation for Washington's effort to contain China's chip-making industry. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo responded by saying Washington won't tolerate the ban. So there's a lot of hand-wringing going on here. There's a lot of hand-wringing going on here by the United States. They're attempting to assert their control and their domination over China. And that's because China is the principal target, but China is getting prepared. And so if we look at the United States as a declining empire, if we look at the United States for what it is, as a failed state, as a failed regime, it's working as designed, but its regime is failing in many respects. So Ukraine is really just one front for this level of failure. Ukraine will not end up how the United States hoped it would go. And if Ukraine is just a single or part of this litmus test, then what's going on with China should be very instructive, because as Xi Jinping says, these risks are becoming more complex, they're becoming graver and bigger by the day. And that's because the United States knows that it's losing. It understands that it has no capability of arresting the Chinese economy. These sanctions on China, while not as numerous as on Russia, have attempted to curtail China's economic progress. I think the United States knows that if it were to sanction China like it did Russia, that the U.S. economy would enter recession immediately. So it's tried to sanction China in a way that allows it to maintain predominance in certain areas like technology. But that ship has largely sailed. I've shown you that 37 out of the 44 advanced technologies in the world now belong to China in terms of who is leading this development worldwide. Who is leading this kind of tech development worldwide? It's China. And that's from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, certainly no friend of China, given that its Australian Defense Department and U.S. State Department and U.S. military contractor funds are all used and have been used to demonize and smear China over and over and over again, and go after journalists and even Twitter users by collaborating with Twitter who say the wrong thing about, for example, Xinjiang and so-called Uyghur genocide, right? So we know that the ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is no friend of China, but yet it has to admit that China is in fact a world leader in high tech. And that's why the United States has been targeting tech so intensely, but it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked, and it won't work, because what's actually going to happen, and what we already see happening, is the producers of semiconductor markets of the technology, this advanced technology, are going to suffer mightily. So the United States will attempt as it may to organize Taiwan and its separatist-leaning government, and it'll try to organize South Korea and Japan. Except Japan has instituted an export ban of its own. It's going to try to organize all of these countries to adhere to things like export bans and look to the United States as the possible next market. The problem with this is that actually the United States does not have the capacity to increase the part of the supply chain within its own domestic economy that China now occupies, both consumption and manufacturing, not of the advanced technology, but of the products that this technology is then employed in. So your phones, your tablets, your computers, a lot of these are produced in China. And the market to purchase them, the vast majority, the most important market is China. So you isolate China, then you isolate yourself. You shoot yourself in the foot. you shoot yourself in the stomach, and eventually you're going to have big problems. And that's why the military front is so important for the United States. And so Xi Jinping is warning us. He's warning all of us, not just the Chinese people, not just the defense ministry of China. He is warning the world that China's security interests are very important and they are preparing for a major power conflict. How could they not prepare for a major power conflict? It would be absurd not to. And China has been, and I'm just going to pull this up really quick. It's not just tech, it's not just economic and military conflict that the United States is seeking. It really is diplomatic influence and political influence. The United States empire would fall in a day if it could not control the narrative, if it couldn't control how people think and behave, especially within the epicenters of its influence, in the United States itself, and of course all of its allied, so-called allied or vassal countries. It would fall in a minute. But here we have, I think, the most important challenge that China presents to the United States. Sure, economically, and you know, cash is king. The United States' economic supremacy, the profits of its big multinationals, of its military-industrial complex. I'm not going to minimize that. I'm not going to say that that isn't primary here. But what really has to be understood and considered is how China's economic ascendance is coupled with its diplomatic and political ascendance as a counterweight and as an alternative to U.S. leadership in its totality, not just in one or another area. And here with Ukraine, I think we have seen that quite dramatically be exposed for more and more people to see, because the Ukraine conflict is such a tectonic, ground-breaking development. So in just the recent days, right, you have Li Hui, the Chinese envoy. He's been going around. He's been in Brussels. He's been in Ukraine. I'm sure he's been speaking to his Russian counterparts. He is attempting to spearhead what China said it was going to do, which is come up with a peace proposal. It came out with a list of principles, and now it is seeking to apply them with those parties involved and interested. The problem here is that the United States, Europe, the EU, NATO countries, for the most part, at least the European vassals of the West, and Ukraine are not interested in. And this is just another example of that. So reported not too long ago, within the last week, you had Li Hui is told in Brussels that the EU expects China to press Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine. And he's faced a consistent message during his extended tour through Europe that started last week in Kiev with a meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. So that's been the consistent message that he's gotten. In a sense, the collective West has said, and Ukraine, of course, parroting this maybe the loudest because they can play the victim here, parroting this notion that Russia needs to surrender and that China needs to be the one to broker that peace will only come if Russia surrenders and unconditionally withdraws from all of Ukraine's territories. I mean, an absolute farcical and downright insulting thing to request of China. But nonetheless, that's where we're at. And I think that the response to this, the response to China's peacemaking efforts is very emblematic of the security challenges that China faces. China is being talked down to. China is being told, do what we say. And when you don't, you will be military encircled, you will be sanctioned, and you will be targeted for war. So a top European Union official has used a high-profile meeting with the Chinese envoy in Brussels to press Beijing again to use its leverage with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Li Hui, Beijing's special envoy for Eurasian affairs and is leading the China's peacemaking efforts, met Enrique Mora, the EU's Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs, on Thursday. So this was late May. After the meeting, the EU said that Mora had stressed the necessity to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. The EU expects China to play a constructive role and use every occasion to uphold and promote the UN Charter and international law, and to recall the necessity to respect the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, said the EU chief. So this is rich. the United States is, I say the United States, it's the European Union, but at this point, the foreign policy is literally the same. But you have the EU here richly, unironically, lecturing China about the UN Charter, lecturing China about the UN Charter. These countries have all participated. The decimation, the EU countries, destruction of Yugoslavia, destruction of Libya, destruction of Syria, um, Iraq, Afghanistan. We go on and on and on. Ukraine, all of these wars that the European so-called garden has attempted to wage. None of that was done with respect to the UN Charter, but yet here we are with China being the one lectured, despite the fact that China has even been in a military conflict in more than 40 years, and that was a very short skirmish with Vietnam. And so, in retrospect, China really hasn't fought a war since, you could maybe say that the United States and China got really close during the first and second Taiwan Strait crises, but it really hasn't been since World War II, to be quite frank. So it's ridiculous that China is being lectured here on this issue. But the expectation includes efforts by Beijing to get Russia to stop the bloodshed and indiscriminate targeting of civilians by immediately and unconditionally withdrawing all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The statement did not include any details of Lee's response, and Beijing did not immediately release its own readout of the meeting. Mora's comments were in line with a warning by the EU's top diplomat Josep Borrell earlier in May that Beijing cannot expect to be good friends with the bloc without Chinese efforts to end Russia's assault against its neighbors. Again, this is the security challenges that China faces. China is a world leader now. China has the respect of all countries, including Ukraine and Russia's, mind you. I don't know if you all watched my segment on the Xi Jinping Zelensky phone call, but if you read that readout, you will see that Zelensky did not have anything bad to say about China. And of course, he's been critical. You know, he spouts off with the mouth. He's not coherent. He doesn't have any one political position, and everything is opportunism for Zelensky. But nonetheless, Ukraine has to respect China because of the economic relations that they have. Russia, of course, and China's partnership is not only strategic and comprehensive, but it's maybe one of the biggest and strongest partnerships that the world has right now, bilaterally, and of course multilaterally. They do so much work together. So this is a consistent message that Li Hui has faced on this front throughout his extended trip through Europe, which started in Kiev with a meeting with Vladimir Zelensky and other senior officials. Zelensky's office posted a lengthy statement after his meeting with Lee, promoting a 10-point formula it put forward in November, which demands Russia's withdrawal and return of all territory seized by Moscow. Similar messaging during subsequent stop on Lee's tours have been underscored by Borrell, with Borrell issuing that warning we said earlier. So France and Germany, largest EU members, have said European policies toward China should not necessarily be in lockstep with Washington. So this is just a summary now of other developments. But the point is that China, as it ascends, it's not just the military front, but as it ascends to this role of being a leader on the diplomatic front, it is being undermined again by the United States. The United States does not want to see peace in Ukraine. The United States is looking to continue to assert its hegemony. It wants Ukraine to do what Ukraine was always supposed to do in this context, which is do what the United States says. Do what the United States says. Be a puppet. Be a military outpost. Be a complete vassal state. Enter NATO eventually. And antagonize Russia so that they can build up to a larger war with Russia. And China is not going to agree to that. In that article, they said that China didn't respond to the message that Ukraine and the EU has been sending on this question of peace. Well, China doesn't have to, because China understands what its position is, and it doesn't have to get into a diplomatic row just because it's been told absolutely not, you're not going to negotiate peace. China is not going to be bullied by the United States, by the EU, by any of these forces into coaxing Russia to do anything, because China has repeatedly said that Russia's security interests also need to be respected. So there's going to have to be major compromise, of course, on all sides. But given the battlefield situation, it's pretty clear that China understands who's going to need to be doing more of the compromising. And that's Ukraine, that's NATO, that's the EU, that's the United States. But China has its own set of concerns. And that's why it is preparing militarily to defend itself from what is the next major storm. And that is potential war between the United States and China over Taiwan, and of course over the entirety of the Asia Pacific, because the Asia Pacific right now is a battleground, just like Eurasia, just like Eastern Europe, just like the former Soviet states, and the Central Asian countries. All of those countries are a battleground for the United States' impending hot war with Russia. The same goes for the Asia Pacific with China. This is a new Cold War. This is not hyperbole. This is not an attempt to mislead. This is a new Cold War, and the United States understands that very much so. And if it because it's taking all of these actions to do so, and that's to amplify one, and that's what's most important here. And I'll just end this story here. The most important thing to understand about China's security concerns, China preparing for war, is that we have to heed what China's leadership, Xi Jinping, Mao Ning, so many of its spokespeople and officialdom have said about the United States and have said about Europe, have said about countries that have expressed very contradictory messages about China. China has said over and over again, it's not about what you say, it's about what you do. So it's not about what Macron says about strategic autonomy, it's about what he does. It's not about what the United States says about possibly freezing the Ukraine conflict and thawing relations with China. It's about what Joe Biden and his administration does. And if we just look at what they do, all of these countries, but especially the United States, you can see that none of it points to diplomacy, to peace, to thawing relations. None of it does. It all points to making the situation worse, escalating conflict, and sparking war. That's where the United States and China are at right now. The United States has placed all of its military marbles into the jar of destroying China, and it is overflowing, and eventually it's going to fall off of a cliff and break, meaning that there will be a war. Those marbles will go everywhere. It's going to be chaotic. And the United States is set to lose that conflict. And that's what's the most concerning thing, not because the United States shouldn't lose. The United States has lost many conflicts in its history, many wars that it has waged. Syria, Afghanistan, Korea, Vietnam. We can go on and on and on. The United States is not necessarily a winner. It likes to pose itself as the most exceptional, the most dominant, the most civilized, all of this nonsense. But it has been a pretty big loser in many respects over the course of the decades, even since it became the hegemon after World War II. But the scary thing should be that the more the United States loses, the more predatory, the more dangerous it becomes, because it has that finger on the nuclear button. It does. The United States is the one country that's used nuclear weapons, and it's the one country that has threatened the use of nuclear weapons repeatedly over the last 7 decades. And it is the country that continues to escalate tensions to the point where such a nuclear catastrophe would be possible again, whether it's through withdrawing from treaties or whether it's from encircling nuclear powers like Russia and China militarily. So this is where things are at. China is preparing for the worst. We should all be preparing for the worst, because unless we're telling people that the worst is coming, they're not going to be prepared, especially in the land of propaganda and misinformation that is the collective West. So that's what's important about. It's not about negativity or pessimism, because that truly is some of the most pessimistic you will hear Xi Jinping on any issue. But it's not about pessimism. It's about realism. And the reality is that conflict is much closer than we may be able to feel tangibly at this moment. And we need to be prepared, and we need to be prepared to speak out, call for, demand, and act on the opposite. For peace, for true self-determination, multipolarity, the principles of the UN Charter, however you want to frame it. That's what we need to be doing each and every day, wherever and however we can, whenever we can. That truly is the mission for humanity and should be for humanity's future. With all that said, everyone, that's the only story I'm going to do today. We're heading into the 2-hour mark. Some people were asking, am I going to do a 3-hour show? Nah, I got to eat lunch, and I have a lot to prepare for, because the other announcement is that I'm going, well, I think I probably said this before. I'm pretty delirious right now. I am going on a break until the 19th. I did say this. So I have a lot to prepare for. With that said, I am still going to be posting clips here. You do want to, if you are able, to support this channel, okay? And especially over this period of a break, because content creators don't get vacation time, all right? So do support this work, because I am making upgrades as we speak, very costly upgrades, but it will all go toward making sure this show continues with the volume that it's going on, and continuing to put out that information on world affairs, global developments, multipolarity, geopolitics that you all come here for. So the best way to support is patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong on a monthly or annual, which most people prefer, basis. That will help me upgrade my computer system and also continue to support the labor that goes into this show. And Substack is a great option annually. I am a writer as well. I haven't been writing as much of late. I do have a new article coming out. Or has come out on CGTN that I will be sharing on all my platforms very soon. But Substack is great for annual options. There's a monthly option, I think, too. But Substack is great, and people do truly like Substack. YouTube membership monthly is available. It's a great community. Shout out to all the YouTube members who are here. And one-time donation options are available in the link tree on the channel banner, in the video description. PayPal, Cashapp, I think are those options. But with that said, I'm going to do the shout out of the super chats in a second. But please do give that support. That support goes a long way, and it will also get you all early access to content, as well as the ability to communicate with me, suggest guests, content, etc. Early notifications. I know if you want to bypass notifications from YouTube, for example, you get those on the paid platforms, but also free platforms like Telegram, which is also in the link tree in the description of the channel banner, which you can subscribe to for free. Substack, if you want to become a free subscriber as well, you get notifications there too. So all of this is to say is that there's plenty of ways to support and to follow my work. And I appreciate all of you for doing so and for coming here to this channel. With that said, let me get to these super chats. I hope that this is all of them. We got a lot of super stickers and some super chats. So David, thanks so much for that super sticker. Appreciate it. JF, thank you so much for that general super sticker and for your membership. Appreciate both. Darren Arnie says, keep up the great work, fellas. You are the unsung heroes. Thank you. Appreciate that, Darren. And definitely shout out to Brian and Mike for a great conversation. Again, thank you, Fred, for the super sticker. Then we have Katie Meggs, who says, is it likely 300 millimeter new ammo will be procured from Amot previously disappeared en route recirculation scheme? Not sure. Again, I'm not the military strategist. Got to have Brian back on for that question. But thank you so much, Katie, for that super chat. David, thanks you so much for your super sticker. We have nobody. Hello, nobody. We have only one option, and that is to end war forever. How do we stop war? We have to create trust. We have to get rid of injustice. Great quote. I agree. We have to create trust. And, a big part of creating that trust is creating trust amongst people-to-people exchanges, going to the countries under fire, being targeted. It is super important, and it's something that I hope to elevate in my work as I plan, hopefully, for more trips to China and traveling a little bit more in the near future to be able to report out. I have to learn how to do that first because I'm mostly a stationary YouTube show producer, I guess you could call me. Rockfin YouTube show producer. Also, shout out to the Rockfin family. Can't forget you all. Thank you so much. Veronica Bushadi, thank you for the super sticker. We have Trevelyan Gale with €3. Thank you so much for the €3. We have Isaac Geis. Isaac, don't ask. I can't pronounce it. This year, the G20 is in India. Next year, G20 is in Brazil. In 2025, it's in Africa. The collective West is going to throw a fit about this. Is the G20 itself on borrowed time, even without World War II? Oh, for sure. Now, this is a great question I'll speak at length on because this is very important. So the G20 is coming up. It is coming up. I think it's coming up in the fall. And this is going to be a very important summit because now, look, the G20, because it includes Russia and China and India and these countries, the G20 is done. It is already done. So this is a great question from a very supportive viewer. Thank you so much. Because the G7 is already done. It's divided. It's not united on anything. It doesn't really come out with anything concrete. It was this nice idea of trying to get countries that at one time were antagonistic toward each other all together to coordinate and integrate economically, diplomatically, all of that. That nice idea was bound for failure because when you have the United States and the collective West involved in anything, they seek to destroy, right? They don't seek to prop up and to build up. They want to destroy for their own gain. And so it's already been over and done with, the G20. It's not a legitimate institution anymore, or if it ever was, because the West has no interest. The collective West has no interest in truly working with countries like Russia and China and even Brazil and India. These countries, even Brazil and India, these countries are only so valuable as long as they are under the thumb of the collective West. Whenever they do anything independent of the collective West, there are consequences. You had the United States support unrest in Brazil. You've had the United States support coups in Brazil. The United States, the last time the United States supported a Brazilian government the most was not even during Bolsonaro. It was during the military dictatorship, the fascist dictatorship in Brazil. So that's the last time that Brazil was really in the warm embrace of the United States, to be quite frank. The era of Lula and Dilma, and then Lula again, has been a very contested time. And even under Bolsonaro, while there was a lot of eye-to-eye ideologically, perhaps, a lot of eye-to-eye maybe in economic philosophy, perhaps, there wasn't always eye-to-eye on the future of Brazil and things like BRICS because there's only so far that a figure like Bolsonaro could go in trying to serve his Western U.S. counterparts. So the reason why this is so big and this point is so good that it's going to be in these BRICS countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, is you're basically going to have the United States coming together during the era of the Ukraine conflict with Russia, with China, with South Africa, and with India for the first time, really, all together since COVID, the pandemic, if we want to use that as a historical marker. And in the era of the Ukraine conflict, we know that all of these countries have taken very hardline positions. You have the United States. The hardline position on Ukraine is Ukraine needs to be victorious against Russia, and we're going to do everything we can to make that happen, even antagonized to the point of potentially sparking World War III. Talking about NATO membership and all of this, stomping on Russia's legitimate security interests. Ukraine has been used to promote and foment war on Russia. And with that fomentation of war on Russia, you've had countries like India and South Africa and Brazil too, having to make hard decisions because the United States still is the economic hegemon and the military hegemon of the world, even as the United States declines in both areas, but most significantly economically. And Ukraine, I think, is showing militarily as well, but economically is where the important wane is, but it still has dollar hegemony. It still is very important in terms of the fact that all of these countries have significant reserves and even significant amounts of debt from U.S. and Western financial institutions. So these countries have all made a concerted stand not to sanction Russia economically And that has angered the United States to the point of increasing its bullying toward countries like South Africa. And India will not be exempt either, because the political class and the elite in the United States is thinking, how do we actually handle India now that it has shown it is not simply just going to toe the line of whatever the United States does in its foreign policy. India wants a sovereign foreign policy as much as it is capable under current conditions. It wants to continue trade with Russia. It has done so. And in this political dispute that India has with China, there is still hesitation for India to be simply and solely a U.S. parrot of its China containment policy. And so it's going to be quite interesting when all of these countries meet up. What is it going to be like? How is the United States going to respond? Is it going to come in lecturing? I predict yes. But will it be able to exert the influence that it wants over something like the G20? I expect that the United States in these G20 meetings, especially the next one coming up in India, that it's going to come in with a really bellicose attitude, while at the same time trying its best to meet on the sidelines, to coordinate with India, with South Africa and others, a kind of alternative plan, right? To try to split up BRICS. I think that will be the strategy as the G20 dissolves de facto, right? The G20 is not going to last very much longer as an institution with any teeth, if it has any at all. I don't think these G20, G7, I don't think they have any teeth on their own. It really is about where geopolitics reside. But nonetheless, I think the war on BRICS will be accelerated. And the United States will try to use its soft power diplomatically in this venue, as well as militarily and economically, to try to nudge these countries. And the United States, if you've read John Perkins's Tales of an Economic Hitman, if you've read people like Michael Parenti, if you've read anything about U.S. foreign policy, you know that the United States is never entering into any relationship without asserting its dominance and without trying to seek control and gain control over resources, over political governance, over the entire economic development situation of the respective country. So if you know that war is really the only way that the United States knows how to speak and approach others, then you know that the conversations that are being had are not diplomatic. And on the sidelines, in secret, what we won't hear is what the United States is going to be winking at India and South Africa and others who seek to join BRICS, winking that, hey, we will retaliate. And we've seen some of that with South Africa already, trying to get South Africa to arrest Putin when he comes for the BRICS summit in August, trying to lecture South Africa on potentially giving weapons to Russia. You had the U.S. envoy, the U.S. ambassador do that. And that's all in response to what's going on, this multipolar moment, this multipolar world, de-dollarization, the world economy changing and shifting toward Russia and China. And these countries do things differently. They have strong central governments. They believe in public investment. They believe in sovereignty and self-determination. And they believe in prosperity for all, not just the tiny few, regardless of whether their models for getting there is different or not. They do have this common vision of lifting up all people. Doesn't mean everyone is equal, but it means that common prosperity is not just a Chinese principle. It also is a principle that Russia employs to an extent. And of course, all these countries that are seeking to join BRICS are looking for the same thing. Doesn't mean there isn't class, there isn't conflict, there isn't inequality, but it means that these leaders and governments are seeking to improve the condition of everyone. And that is a huge threat. So the G20 is going to be very interesting. So your question is very important, because this is going to be the first time that the United States has to sit with Russia, with China, with India, with the BRICS countries, and all in Brazil, etc. And we will see how the United States responds. I don't think it will be good. I also can predict, if Biden is the president, that things like this will be canceled in the near future. Because or U.S. participation or what have you. The United States almost canceled its attendance at the G7, what it finds to be a more important meeting than the G20 because of domestic issues. Now, Biden himself is a domestic issue because he's not always doing well physically, mentally, and also has the diplomatic skills of a raccoon, of like a rabid raccoon. He does not have any. He uh, flies off the handle, gaffes, abound, and has no coherency in his foreign policy rhetoric. And there's a lot of coherency in the foreign policy, and it's just whatever the neocon foreign policy establishment wants. Not a lot of coherency in the diplomatic realm, which matters a lot. It does matter a lot. If you cannot be coherent in the diplomatic realm, you lose legitimacy quite fast. That's been the story of the United States. So nobody says a million thanks for your great work helping us see our insanity. First step to sanity is recognizing our insanity. Evolution is via expansions in consciousness. Thanks so much for that comment and for the generous super chat. All right, everybody. Let me just take a swig of water. I'm getting a little dry over here. So this looks like it's going to be it, everybody. This looks like it's going to be it. So one last plug, because I didn't do it at all during the beginning of the program. I like to respect my guests. I don't like to plug for my channel too much during having guests on. One last plug. Patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong is the best place to support my work as I upgrade equipment, make necessary upgrades, pay labor, because some people do some work for me on a volunteer basis, a very generous thing. But I like to pay them as much as I can, for what is fair and what I'm able to do. But the technology upgrades are a big part of this. So supporting me annually on Patreon is the best place. Supporting me on Substack annually or monthly is another great option. Supporting me on YouTube is another great option. And even one-time options on PayPal and Cashapp are other great options to support this work and help it continue. When I return, there will be a lot of things I want to roll out for this hot summer we've got going on geopolitically and temperature-wise, I'm sure, in many places in the world. I will be vlogging a bit more. I want to do some vlogging stuff. I'm going to start out exclusive to subscribers on Patreon and Substack, etc., because I need to test this stuff out. I don't want, I want to respect, I'm sure it'll work out. So I'm going to respect my paid members, but I want to test out the equipment on a live basis, be outside sometimes, answer questions, do some personal things like that with all of you when I'm not doing this here, not doing interviews, not doing my own streams through this much more. For me, this is much more natural to have kind of a locked in place, but I've gotten equipment to be able to vlog more. And hopefully I'm going to roll that out at an event on the 6th. Oh, so speaking of which, I want to send an Eventbrite. Don't go anywhere. You last 1,000 people here in the chat. Hold on one second. I need to send you an event because I will be speaking at an event with Carlos Martinez, a dear friend of mine. I'm going to be with him in London first as part of my holiday, and I will be speaking at his book launch on China. And so I want to send you the Eventbrite in the chat, all right? Because this is important. I want you all to be there. I'm going to be streaming it live on this channel, whether it's through their equipment over at the Karl Marx Library, which is where the event will be, or it'll be through my vlogging equipment if I can get it up and running and can get some help maneuvering it. I have this small rig set up. I don't know if it'll be good enough. I don't know if I'm going to try to test it beforehand while I'm over there. But nonetheless, I want to send this link, and then I'm going to pull it up on the screen. So you can register on Eventbrite but I will be streaming it here. But it's on June 6th. It'll be in the afternoon over here. Okay, so the link is in the chat now. It's The East is Still Red. Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. Lots of cool speakers. You're going to have the ambassador, Venezuelan ambassador, speaking as well. Carlos Martinez, of course. Jenny Clegg, who has a great book on multipolarity, and others. So that will be June 6th, 2023 at 7 p.m. Let me pull it up, actually. All right, let me pull it up on the screen. I'm glad that a lot of you are still here. So here it is. The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. There's all of our photos. He used a funny photo for me. And no worries. So it's from Praxis Press. The East is Still Red. Very good book. I mean, if you want not just geopolitics, but to dive deep into China's internal policies on climate, on poverty alleviation, this is the book to really get. So here you can register on Eventbrite, and it's a new book where it provides a concise, deeply researched, and well-argued account that China's remarkable rise can only be understood by acknowledging its socialist past, present, and future. So that's important because a lot of people would say, no, it's just capitalist. No, it's imperialist, or no, it's, neoliberal. It's in with Wall Street. All of this, it's nonsense. But here are the speakers, okay? So you have Jenny Clegg, Robert McKenzie, who's an editor at the Morning Star. You have the Venezuelan ambassador to the UK, Rocio Manero Gonzalez, me, and Carlos. So I will be speaking. You can register on the Eventbrite for the Zoom, or register for online or Zoom event there. And register, and also just if you want to, I think register just to be involved. You can be involved if there's a Q&A. But also you can watch it here. I'm going to be streaming it here. So if that's 7 p.m. London, that will be 2 p.m. here on June 6th. What day is that? That is Tuesday. So in the afternoon, it's not going to be a huge stream, but it will be a great event. And I'll try to give good remarks. I don't know how much I'll be able to prepare for the remarks, but nonetheless, I will be speaking, and I'm very excited about that. So that's the last thing I wanted to say in terms of announcements, of course, about this, supporting the channel, and then the holiday. So I'm going to be in Europe. I'm going to be traveling around Europe until the 19th of June. And after that, I'll probably need some time to get back into things. So midweek, that week, I'll probably be back streaming once I recover. And hopefully I can get up some good content and material once I return. I'm sure things will be very interesting worldwide, and there'll be a lot to catch up on. So you'll be able to find, I'll try to check in the community. I'll try to post some vacation photos, maybe in the community, on Patreon, on Substack. I'll definitely try to keep you all somewhat connected to what I've been up to, within reason, of course. So this is a holiday. And expect clips on here, okay? And yeah, so it's going to be great. I do not take many vacations. I need to take more. I think we all, if we have the ability, need to take more vacations. Most of us, though, don't have it. And I've certainly been in that position at many points in my life. So I look forward to this break, even if it is, I'm in the United States, and vacations can, believe it or not, provoke like anxiety, not because the vacation is not relaxing, but it takes a lot of preparations and money. And, there's, once you've been working a lot for years, your body gets used to being overworked. And I wouldn't say I'm overworked at this moment in my life, but surely I work hard, and taking breaks does not come as naturally as perhaps it should. So that's food for thought for all of you. I've definitely done some psychology takes and some other things. Some people are saying I should have good weather. I am seeing a lot of good weather out in the UK and other places I will be, Germany. I'm forgetting Prague. and Brussels. Yeah, I'm going to be in basically the belly of the NATO/EU beast. I'm very interested, even though this is a vacation and it's been in the works since before the Ukraine conflict and conversation. And it's really been a vacation we've just wanted to take, me and my wife. And now it's so many interesting things are happening worldwide that involve Europe's position in the world. I'm very curious to see where people are at. Hopefully, I do know people. I'm going to be meeting with the legendary Chen Wei-Hua. Looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to getting a sense of where people are at, how people think out in those ways, because I think it's going to be a really hot mess of a contradiction, just like it is here in the United States. So the replay will be here for everyone who just came in. I know this was an early stream, but I should go. I got to prepare lunch. I got to prepare myself for this trip. Appreciate all of you. I'll be back soon. Okay. Really appreciate all your support. It really is humbling. This channel has really taken off, at least from my perspective. And I hope that it continues when I return. So be on the lookout. You'll get notified about the clips, maybe by YouTube. And I will also be preparing the way when I come back for more great programming. All right. So have a good one, everyone. Until the next time I am live later in the summer, I'll be coming back probably the kickoff of summer. I wish you all well. I hope you all remain steadfast in your convictions and continue to be able to take care of yourselves, your families, your comrades, your colleagues, and that that you return here knowing that this is a channel where you can get some respite from the noise of the imperial albatross, the noise of the declining empire centered in the United States, and of course the collective West. So I hope that you maintain your enthusiasm and that I get to have the privilege of coming back here again to be with all of you live, talking about what we talk about: peace, geopolitics, war, the central questions of all of our futures. Good morning, good evening, good night, or good afternoon, wherever you all are. Peace out. I will see you all again next time.